We've got another Feed Swap Saturday here on Fear Daily, and I've got a nonfiction podcast for you today that I think is really going to hit the spot for you lovers of the grim and the spooky. It's a podcast called Macabrium, and it's a show driven by curiosity and the deep desire to uncover the fascinating, the dark, and the extraordinary. But what's really unique here is that Macabrium is built around two compelling episodes a week. The first is Dark History and True Crime, which dives into the stories of the past that have shaped humanity in profound and sometimes even unsettling ways. And the second, called Lore and Legends, focuses on the myths and folklore that have been handed down through the generations, shaping how we see the world and ourselves. Now, every episode of Macabrium invites listeners to sink deep into the stories, making space for reflection, connection, and the occasional chill down your spine, which I know you like. But Macabrium is more than just a podcast. It's a tribute to the timeless appeal of storytelling. It's a show that values curiosity, intellect, and the art of bringing stories to life. But look, you don't really have to take my word for it, because today we're going to bring you an episode of the Lore and Legends segment of Macabrium titled The Murder Hole Room: Hauntings at Leap Castle, and it's the first of two parts. Now, if you enjoy it, please definitely go check out everything else they have to offer, because this show really is quite diverse, and it has a lot of opportunities for folks like us to really dig deep into the shadows. So what are you waiting for, y'all? Just go follow Macabrium today on your favorite podcasting app, and in the meantime, here is The Murder Hole Room: Hauntings at Leap Castle.
You came with a recorder, a torchlight, and a full battery. You checked the gear twice, once in the car, once again before stepping over the threshold. You were ready for creaking floorboards, cold drafts, even the sound of distant footsteps, but you weren't ready for this. You're standing in what's known as the Murder Hole Room. The stone walls sweat with damp. Your breath fogs in front of you, though there's no wind, no broken windows. Just the oppressive stillness of a place with a long history of violence. Then it begins. A low sound behind you. Footsteps on the narrow stair. Slow, measured. You call out, but no answer comes. Your torch flickers. The recorder picks up something the ear can't hear, a dragging sound. Metal on stone. And then, voices. Whispered Latin. A mass. Something in the air changes. You don't feel alone. Hello, listener, and welcome to another episode of Macabrium's Lore and Legends. I'm your host, Derek, and today, and for the next several weeks, we are camping out in an extremely haunted location in Ireland that is home to numerous documented hauntings in its history, to fully explore its disturbing legacy beginning in the 1500s. This series is about Leap Castle. Think of it as a sort of Leap Castle extended universe, because events and characters will make appearances in one another's stories due to the long and relatively constant supernatural events documented by its various occupants over the years. Leap Castle stands among the oldest continuously occupied fortresses in Ireland, its stone walls steeped in centuries of violence, treachery, and resilience. The structure seen today likely rose in the early 1500s under the O'Bannon clan, who served as subordinate lords beneath the dominant O'Carrolls. But the site's roots stretch deeper. Before stone was ever laid, the rocky outcrop it sits on was a gathering place for druids, used in ritual and initiation long before Christianity ever touched these lands. The castle's name comes from a grim contest for leadership. Two brothers from the clan, each claiming the right to rule, agreed to a fatal trial. They were to leap from the high limestone ridge where the castle now stands. The one who lived would take the mantle of chieftain. This cruel gamble gave the castle both its name and its first blood. Soon after, the O'Carroll clan seized the site and fortified it into one of their chief strongholds. Strategically positioned to oversee the pass through the Slieve Blue Mountains, Leap Castle became a key seat of power. Few castles matched its defensive might. The O'Carrolls ruled with a harsh hand, known for their internal feuds and relentless ambition. Brother often turned on brother, and their enemies fared no better. The walls of Leap saw betrayal as often as they saw battle. The O'Carroll hold ended in 1642, when the castle fell into the hands of an English soldier, John Darby, serving under Cromwell. From that point, the Darby family occupied Leap for nearly 3 centuries. They reshaped the building over generations, adding to its form and legend alike. But in 1922, during Ireland's War for Independence, Leap Castle was burned and gutted, its halls looted and left in ruins. It remained empty for decades, until 1974, when Peter Bartlett, an Australian with ancestral ties to the region, took ownership and began repairs. His efforts stirred life back into the long, silent halls. The castle is strategically located at the boundary of 2 Irish provinces. Perhaps the most infamous event that led to the castle's reputation as a haunted site occurred in the 16th century, when the O'Carroll family was embroiled in a bitter feud over succession. The story goes that Taigh O'Carroll murdered his brother, Thaddeus O'Carroll, to take control of the castle. Thaddeus had been the rightful heir to Leap Castle, but Taigh, in a bloody act of treachery, took Thaddeus's life. This murder is said to have occurred in what became known as the Bloody Chapel of the castle, a room associated with deep tragedy. After Thaddeus's death, Taigh was said to have been plagued by remorse and guilt, and he quickly lost his grip on sanity. Many reports suggest that the curse of the O'Carrolls, rooted in that act of treachery, began with Thaddeus's untimely death. The chapel, where Thaddeus's body was believed to have been left to rot, was where much of the castle's dark energy seemed to center. The chapel itself is a dark, Gothic structure, and it was here that many of the earliest hauntings began to be reported. Another significant haunting at Leap Castle is attributed to the elemental spirit, which some believe was summoned or released by the O'Carroll family. The elemental is a malevolent and terrifying creature that allegedly resides in the castle, its form twisted, grotesque, and vile. Local legend claims that an O'Carroll priest, who was believed to have practiced dark magic, performed an occult ritual in the chapel in an attempt to summon spiritual powers. What he summoned was a terrifying force of nature, an elemental, a spirit of dark power bound to the earth. This elemental, unlike other spirits, was said to be a vicious, insatiable entity that tormented anyone who entered the castle after its awakening. The priest's actions only seemed to intensify the curse that plagued the castle, as the elemental became linked to the O'Carroll's bloodline. The family's already violent tendencies were now compounded by the influence of the creature, which was believed to have driven them further into madness, violence, and tragedy. The elemental is often depicted as a shadowy figure, largely unseen but always present. It is said to crawl through the castle, dragging its long, skeletal limbs along the walls, and the chilling sound of its scraping feet has been reported by those who have stayed in the castle to this day. Mildred Darby is perhaps responsible for shaping the enduring reputation of Leap Castle. As the wife of Jonathan Charles Darby, the last of the Darby family to own the castle, she resided there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. An accomplished Gothic novelist writing under the pseudonym Andrew Merry, Mildred was deeply fascinated by the supernatural and frequently conducted seances within the castle's walls. Her first-hand accounts of paranormal experiences at Leap Castle were instrumental in bringing its hauntings to public attention. In a 1908 article for the Occult Review, she vividly described the elemental. Suddenly, 2 hands were laid on my shoulders. I turned round sharply and saw, as clearly as I see you now, a grey thing standing a couple feet from me. Human in shape, a little shorter than I am. Its face was human, or to be more accurate, inhuman in its vileness. Mildred's writings, combining personal experiences with Gothic fiction, helped cement the castle's status in popular culture as a site of intense supernatural activity. Now, there is a particular room in Leap Castle that has become known as another source of its dark energy due to its role in much of the violence that has occurred there. The Murder Hole Room is a notorious part of the castle's history, located in the lower levels of the building. It's infamous for its association with brutal executions and violent acts during the time of the O'Carroll family. The room gets its name from the method used to kill prisoners or enemies of the family. The room itself has a trap door or hole in the floor, through which victims were dropped into a pit below, often filled with spikes or other deadly implements. Some versions of the story also suggest that victims were dropped directly onto a waste pit or were impaled. Beyond its physical function, the Murder Hole Room has become central to the supernatural stories surrounding Leap Castle. Hauntings are often said to be tied to the room, with many reports claiming strange sensations of being watched, eerie cold spots, and disembodied sounds emanating from within. The room is often described as having an oppressive atmosphere, a lingering presence. Visitors to the castle have reported feeling a sudden chill or overcome by a sense of dread when approaching the room. The room figures into the broader mythology of Leap Castle's hauntings, where many believe that the spirits of the murdered still haunt the place, unable to find peace due to the violent and unjust nature of their deaths. One of the most famous and well-documented stories is that of a paranormal investigator named Michael, who reported hearing unsettling noises in the Murder Hole Room. His claims involved the sensation of being watched and hearing faint whispers, or the scraping sound of something moving in the room, even when it was physically empty. Others who have explored the area claim to have seen dark shapes or flickering lights near the room. The stories of Leap Castle's hauntings have been passed down through generations, blending historical fact with local legend, and now are woven into the very fabric of Irish folklore, carrying the curse of the O'Carrolls and the tortured spirits of those who met their ends within the castle walls. Today, the castle is cared for by the Ryan family, who continue the long work of restoration. Though rebuilt in parts, the spirit of the place endures, scarred, proud, and haunted by everything it has witnessed. According to the official Leap Castle website, it looks like the Ryans sometimes open Leap Castle to tourists. Now, on this episode of Lore and Legends, I'm actually telling you 2 short stories about Leap Castle, because there is just so much story to tell about this extremely haunted place. So, get comfy, dim the lights, maybe light a candle or 2 to set the mood, and let me transport you to Ireland and what has to be one of the most haunted places on Earth, Leap Castle. Part 1. Murder in the Bloody Chapel. God between us and all harm. There's places in Ireland where the ground has taken in too much of what it should not, and no plough or prayer will put it right again. Leap Castle is one such place, and what happened in its chapel long ago is neither buried nor forgotten. The walls still stand, but peace has never held there. The castle rises from a ridge in County Offaly, on land the O'Bannons once claimed. It was they who built it first, stone on stone, without blessing, until the O'Carrolls took it by force. That was in the days when clan law was made by hand and fire, and men ruled only as long as they could keep others from cutting them down. Leap Castle belonged to the O'Carrolls after that, and their name filled the tower. They held it like a clenched fist, blood on the steps, blood in the halls. No man dared climb its road without cause. Yet within it, there was a single room given to silence, high in the south tower, turned to face the light. A chapel, not ordained, but still respected. There, a priest among them, one of their own blood, said Mass. Not for show, not for coin, but because he believed the rites held meaning. He spoke the words proper and slow, and the men of the castle, hardened though they were, would kneel at the sound of them. It was that sound, more than anything, that stirred hatred in one heart. The O'Carrolls ruled by strength and fear. They were not kings, but no king crossed them. In the high years of their power, Leap Castle was their stronghold, and every stone of it was paid for twice, once in coin or cattle, and again in spilled blood. Their name held weight across the land, though few spoke it with respect. They were remembered for what they did, not how they were loved. When Mulrooney O'Carroll died, struck down by sickness, not sword, he left behind no clear heir. There was land to divide, weapons to claim, and the name itself to carry. 2 sons stood highest among the rest. The elder was Thaddeus, called the Quiet by some. He had been ordained a priest. The younger brother, Tig, was a soldier in every bone. He knew how to drive men with fear and how to take what he wanted without waiting to be offered it. He believed the clan owed him loyalty, not because he was kind, but because he had earned it in battle. His victories were real. His rage was quick, and he could not understand why his brother, who shed no blood and ruled no fields, was spoken of as a leader. The quarrel between them was not loud. It brewed quietly over winters and long rides. When Tig saw the men of the castle kneel before Thaddeus, not in fear but in willing silence, his face turned cold. He saw the way Thaddeus listened when the elders spoke and how they waited for his answer. In Tig's mind, his brother was gathering power under the cloth, turning loyalty away from the rightful heir. Tig was not a man to speak his resentment. He kept it close, but he counted every nod, every favor, every moment his brother stood at the center of the room. And one morning, with no battle left to fight and no more patience to give, he made his choice. The chapel sat high in the south tower, cut from the same limestone as the rest of Leap. There was no adornment on its door, no mark to show it sacred. The walls were bare, the windows narrow, and the light that came through them fell in thin strips across the stone. Still, it was the only room in the castle where voices lowered without command. Thaddeus kept it that way. He did not decorate. He placed no symbols but the cross above the altar, carved from oak and set into the wall by his own hand. There was no choir, only him reading the rites, and no congregation but the soldiers and servants who chose to come. And they did come. Not all, not always, but often enough that the castle grew used to the rhythm of his mass. He said it at dawn on feast days and at mid-morning when the fields were dry. He stood behind the altar with the book open before him, and his hands moved slowly, never theatrical, never hurried. He spoke Latin not as a scholar, but as one who believed each word had meaning. And when he raised the chalice, no man spoke over it. Even those who knew him only by name came to him in quiet. A boy whose father had been hanged by the O'Connors, a stable hand whose wife bled in childbirth, a cousin who feared she had brought shame to her name. Thaddeus heard them all. He did not promise heaven or healing, but he listened, and he remembered their words, and that was enough. Tig, when he entered, did not kneel. He stood at the back with his arms folded. He would leave before the closing prayer. And though he never spoke against his brother, men began to notice the way he stared during the readings, the way he shook his head when others bowed theirs. The chapel became a wound in his pride, a place where the name of O'Carroll was set aside for scripture, and where the eldest son drew respect with nothing but a book and a clear voice. That room, with its rough-hewn altar and its floor smoothed by boots and knees, had known silence, grief, and hope. But it had not yet known murder. That came next. It was a day without rain. The grass below the walls held its color, and the wind turned the flags gently, not in warning. No horn sounded, no rider brought ill news. The kitchens worked as they always did, and the garrison drilled in the yard with dull weapons, not expecting visitors. By every mark of the day, nothing was out of place. Inside the chapel, Thaddeus began Mass as he always had. The same words, the same hands, the same wooden chalice brought from the stores below. His vestments were plain, worn thin at the cuffs. He stood before the altar with the book opened and the candles lit. A few men knelt before him, soldiers mostly, some young, with scars down their faces and arms. They watched him in silence, as they always did. There was no chant, just the slow, steady rise and fall of his voice. The door opened. Teig entered alone. No one turned and greeted him. They heard his boots on the stone and knew who it was. He passed between them without a word. He wore no mail, only a long tunic dyed dark, and at his belt was a narrow dagger, a soldier's blade, not meant for ceremony. He did not stop until he reached the altar. Thaddeus looked up. He did not flinch. He did not step back. The words of the prayer were still on his lips. Teig struck once. The dagger passed between the ribs, angled toward the heart. It was not a clumsy blow. It was aimed by someone who had killed before. Thaddeus fell forward onto the altar. The chalice tipped with him, spilling the wine across the wood. His hand caught the edge of the stone, then slid off. He did not cry out. The men behind him, those kneeling, rose too late. Teig had already turned. He walked back down the center of the chapel, with the blade still in his hand. No one stopped him. No one dared. The chapel held its silence. From that hour, the floor bore the mark of it. The blood was wiped away. The altar was cleaned. The dagger was never seen again. But the stain did not leave. Though the chapel remained standing, it was not used again in the same way. The murder had been done in daylight, before witnesses, during the Mass. It was not a killing of necessity. It was not war. It was not justice. It was hatred and pride, and the end of peace in Leap Castle. They buried Thaddeus without procession. No bell rang for him. No rites were spoken at the graveside. It was said that even the priest who came from Birr to see the body refused to speak over it. The men of the castle lowered him into the earth at the edge of the lower field beside the old yew tree. No marker was placed. Teig said nothing to any man. He did not flee. He did not weep. He stayed in the castle, taking up his father's chair in the great hall, and none among the O'Carrolls moved against him. Some feared him, some despised him, and some, in private, said he had only done what was needed to keep the clan strong. But none of them entered the chapel again. The room was sealed for a time. They barred the door and let the candles burn down. The altar stood as it had before, now stripped of the book, the chalice, and the man who had stood behind it. But the stain remained. The stone on which Thaddeus fell held the mark, dark like wine turned to pitch, and no amount of scrubbing would take it up. Years passed, and the servants said the room never lost its smell of old blood and tallow. They said oil lamps would not stay lit there, though the glass was clean and the wicks were sound. One mason, brought in to repoint the stonework, refused to finish the job, saying he felt watched. His hands trembled when he spoke. He left that same day and did not return. Some said they heard steps on the chapel stair long after nightfall. Not hurried, not heavy, just paced, measured, like a man walking toward the altar. One guard swore he heard the sound of Latin being read at dawn, though the room had been locked for years. Even when new lords took the castle, the chapel remained untouched. Families changed, the name O'Carroll faded from the land, but that room stayed empty. Windows cracked, birds nested in the rafters, and still no one stepped inside, unless forced. They called it the Bloody Chapel after that. Not in ceremony, not to tell stories. They called it so because that's what it was. A place where a brother struck down a brother during the Mass, with witnesses present and no cause but jealousy. To this day, the stone is still there, the mark still seen, and no mass has been said in that room since. In time, the people spoke of more than the murder, of shadows seen moving when no one stood near, of figures in red crossing the chapel stair, of voices low and breathless heard through the locked door, and deeper still, of what was found hidden behind the altar wall. A narrow shaft filled with bones, dropped there long before and left. An oubliette, a death pit. The bones were taken out in carts, cart after cart, and still more beneath them. That was not Thaddeus's doing. That was the O'Carrolls before him, and after. The bloody chapel is not cursed by legend. It is marked by deed. What happened there was not imagined, not made to frighten children. It was a real death, by a real hand, in a room meant for mercy. That kind of act settles into stone and stays. Even now, those who visit say they do not linger long in that tower. The floor still bears a mark, the altar still stands untouched, and the silence in that room is not peace. Leap Castle carries many stories, but this is the first, the one that made the rest possible. Part 2. The Red Lady. Long before our own time, on the borderlands of Offaly, Leap Castle rose carved from the rocky crag that held it aloft. It was no place of comfort or welcome. Its walls, blackened by the passing of countless years, seemed to drink in the daylight, leaving the valley below in a gloom even at high noon. From its narrow windows the land stretched out like a patchwork of bog and barren hill, a view made for watchmen, not dreamers. The stones of the castle bore the mark of their purpose, built not as a haven, but as a bastion against man and time. Blood had sunk deep into that stone, not by accident, but by design. For centuries the O'Carroll family ruled by the sword, and by the code they knew best, that alliances could be bent or broken, and that even the bonds of kinship could be severed with cold steel. They were no strangers to betrayal. Fathers turned on their sons, brothers competed in tests of strength and cunning, and uncles plotted with poison while breaking bread. It was said that to be born an O'Carroll was to carry death in your shadow, and the castle walls had known no peace for it. Within Leap's dark chambers life unfolded beneath the watchful eyes of the dead. The O'Carrolls trusted few outside their walls and not many within them. Guests were welcomed at great feasts, their plates piled high with venison and their cups brimming with mead, but an armed guard was never far, and alliances born at the banquet hall often ended abruptly in the chapel above or the banquet room below. This was no story of noble warriors or just rulers. For the O'Carrolls, life's triumph lay in survival and conquest, whatever means they required. There was a time when joy had crossed the gates of Leap Castle, though it came as a fleeting guest. She was barely more than a girl when she arrived, no taller than the men who stood guard at the portcullis, but with a presence that softened even their hardened eyes. Her gown, a deep green stitched with delicate threading, marked her as a noblewoman, and though she carried herself with grace, her youth was plain in the lightness of her step and the curiosity in her gaze. She had been wed to the lord of the castle, though not by choice. Such arrangements were made for politics, not love. Yet she did not come with bitterness. Instead, she arrived with hope. To those who glimpsed her in her early days at the castle, she seemed to shine against its shadowed stones. The villagers in the valley, accustomed to the O'Carroll scowl, talked of her beauty and gentleness. They spoke of the way she paused to exchange a kind word with the servants as she passed, and how her laughter seemed to carry further than expected across the castle's old courtyards. Her eyes, a deep and lively brown, searched the faces around her earnestly, as if their hidden cruelties were not yet hers to imagine. Her days in those first months were filled with the kind of simple pleasures she had grown up with in her father's more peaceful manner. She walked the gardens, still struggling to thrive amid the castle's grey walls, and she marveled at the tapestry work in the great hall, though the scenes they stitched were more violent than beautiful. She would sit by the hearth in the evenings, stitching in hand, speaking gently to her ladies as an old dog dozed at her feet. She believed she could bring warmth to a place so plainly starved of it. The Lord, her husband, had shown himself to be a fiery man. When he wanted her favor, he could play the charmer well enough. He took her hand at feasts and praised her before his men. He boasted of her beauty with a smile that seemed genuine, but even then his laughter rang too loud. His compliments came too quick. There was something tightly coiled in his movements, as though restlessness had a grip on him that he could not shake. She did not yet know whether to fear it. Still, in those early days, she tried to love him. She took his arm when they walked the halls, and she shared his ambitions when he spoke of his lands and the wealth they might bring. She listened intently, even when he spoke of endless disputes, of quarrels with neighbors and cousins that seemed petty to her, but consumed his thoughts. She assured herself it was only his responsibilities that warned him against tenderness, and convinced herself that distance could be melted with patience. But as the seasons turned, meaning to prove her wrong, the servants first noticed the change. Soon after, the villagers would speak of it too. They no longer saw her walking the courtyard or tending to the wilting garden as they had before. She still sat in the great hall at the Lord's side during feasts, but her smiles grew scarce, and her face resigned, thoughtful, older than her years. Though she tried to conceal it, her words grew wary and slower when addressing the Lord, and they carried the caution of one who had learned what consequences might follow should she overstep. It wasn't a single moment that marked her decline, but many small ones, each chipping away at her spirit as water wears down stone. She discovered in time her husband's passions were as brief as the spring bloom, his needs shifting elsewhere with the same ferocity that had once been directed toward her. He would vanish for days, returning with no explanation, his temper short and his affections hollow. Servants carried rumors of his meetings with a woman whose name the young wife never dared to ask, but she heard enough to know her place in his life had been taken. What small freedoms she'd possessed were stripped from her one by one. Doors that had always stood open to her were bolted shut, and her once welcoming chambers felt colder and emptier with each passing night. The long stone corridors that she had once walked with head held high now seemed to stretch endlessly, and it seemed to her that every person she passed would turn their eyes away, avoiding the sadness now plain in hers. She began to dream of home, though she knew it was out of reach. The green gown with its fine stitching was replaced by simpler garments, and her hands grew busy not with idle stitching in the comforts of the hearth, but trembling prayers offered in the darkness of her chambers. The laughter that had once echoed faintly across the courtyard was silenced, and though life carried on within the walls of Leap Castle, slowly, it seemed, hers was fading. She no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to the stone, to the legacy of the castle, and it tightened its hold on her with every passing day. There was a time when she still waited by the window for him. Night after night, as the flickering torches lit the path to Leap Castle's gate, she sat, her stitching untouched, on her lap. She counted the hours, listening for the steady clatter of hooves across the stone bridge, a sound that used to mean his return. But the nights grew longer, and his absences stretched like neglected vines, tangling across the days with no reason. When he did return, it was always hurried and hollow. Any warmth had been replaced by carelessness, any touch by a fleeting pat that made her feel more like the hounds in the yard than his wife. The servants, the ones who swept endless stairwells and set platters on long tables, saw much but said little. Their faces turned down with the practiced art of people who knew better than to speak in a house ruled by the O'Carrolls. But those quiet glances told her all she needed to know. She began noticing the faint snickers, the hurried silences when she entered a room. There was a woman. The villagers spoke of her before the rumors wound their way up the Lord's cold halls. The mistress was no innocent. She was a woman of wit and poise, with a knowing way about her and a tongue that knew how to flatter men in power. She came from wealth, though nowhere near the status of the O'Carrolls, but ambition could make up that distance, and she had her sights set higher. She understood the lure of power better than most, and knew how to wield it, even on a man who prided himself on being untouchable. The Lord had succumbed to her sly smiles and her promises of indulgence, all while his young wife sat waiting. The distance between husband and wife grew, and though she longed to ask, to plead with him in the privacy of their chambers, words dried up in her throat at the sight of him. His eyes no longer drifted to hers. They darted past her as if she were part of the stonework. When she attempted to speak, to ask when he might return next, or if he might want to walk the gardens with her as they once had, he brushed her aside with answers that were neither cruel nor kind. They meant only to close a door. Still, the truth found her. It came one evening as she wandered the corridors she once cherished. Her path brought her to a gallery window that overlooked the stables. A figure stood there in the twilight, her cloak draped over her shoulders. She carried herself lightly, though the way she tossed her head when she laughed made it clear she held sway over those around her. Beside her, the Lord leaned close, his hand on her elbow as he whispered something that brought a smile to her lips. They spoke in low tones, but the image burned into the young wife's mind faster than any words could have. It wasn't anger that came first. It was disbelief, a desperate refusal to see what was plain before her. She froze, clutching the window ledge, knowing she could not stay where she stood nor bring herself to leave. Her throat tightened, but it was not tears she swallowed. It took more than a moment for the traces of hope within her to die, and longer still for them to be replaced. When he returned that night, she bade him no welcome. She sat upright in her chair as he entered the hall, his hair damp from the road and his cloak still smudged from the day's travels. He ate without looking up, and when he finally glanced at her, her gaze struck him harder than any words might have. His fork clattered to the plate as her eyes stayed fastened on his, unyielding in their demand for an answer. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, she asked him. She said the words aloud, letting each one land no matter how much it pained her. The mistress's name was not spoken, but it did not need to be. The color drained from his face, and for once, words failed him. He began to pace the room, his boots scuffing the edges of the rugs as he told her she misunderstood, that she should not fool herself with the gossip of servants and villagers. But his voice betrayed the truth buried in the denials. Her hurt finally spilled over. She rose, facing him as though she were addressing a stranger, her words no longer trembling but steady and fierce. She spoke of his promises, of the life he had handed her only to strip it away. Her tone did not rise. It did not need to. She told him the smallest slights she'd endured, the cruelties he thought he'd hidden, and the way his absence had hollowed out the castle's halls for her until they felt more like a tomb than a home. When she was done, silence filled the room between them, as wide and unforgiving as the crags below Leap's walls. He said nothing in return, only stared at her with a glare that had more to do with his wounded pride than any remorse or guilt. He left her standing there just as she was, as though the firelight on her face would cease to glow once the door closed behind him. For the first time, she did not run after him. That was the night the last shreds of her hope fell away. She sat up long after the candles burned low, staring into the hearth, the warm long since gone cold. Somewhere, in her silent resolve, she understood that the life she thought she could build in this castle had been no more than a dream meant to fade. There were nights at Leap Castle when the silence felt louder than any sound, when the creak of old timbers and the occasional scatter of mice were the only companions to those who dared lie awake. It was on one of those nights that she resolved to confront him, her husband, her betrayer. The thought weighed on her as she climbed the stone stairs to his chamber. She had rehearsed her words in her mind, fierce and unforgiving, but with each step closer to his door, her heart quickened. Inside, the hearth flickered low, casting its amber light on the uneven stones. He sat at his table, a goblet of wine half forgotten beside him, staring at the maps and parchments strewed across the wood. His coat was thrown carelessly over a chair, and his boots rested near the fire. He was a man at ease, or perhaps merely indifferent. But when the door opened, he looked up. Something in her face must have struck him then, for he straightened, stiffening as she stepped inside. The heavy door groaned as it shut behind her. "What is this?" he asked, though his voice carried no warmth with it. His tone was weary, as though he expected a quarrel. She stopped some feet from the table, unwilling to come closer. Her hands were clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. Though she lifted her chin, her voice came soft at first. "You have shamed me," she said. "You have shamed your own name." His hand moved to the goblet, but he did not drink. His dark eyes narrowed, and a faint scoff escaped him. "Is that what fills your thoughts? Petty words carried up staircases by servants?" "They are no words of servants, nor of rumour," she snapped, her voice rising. "I have seen enough. I have seen her, and I have seen you." Her words caught him off guard this time, drawing a breath from him. "And if I've wronged you, what then? You know nothing of the things I must do to keep this house, to hold this land," he said, leaning forward, his tone hardening like stone. "You think loyalty is simple. You've no notion of the sacrifices it takes." She stared at him, incredulous. "Sacrifices," she repeated bitterly. "You speak of sacrifices as though they are yours to claim. I gave up my home, my family. I have endured you, and this place so cold, it eats you alive. I gave all I had to be your wife, to stand beside you, and you speak of sacrifice. You've treated me as a fool, a piece of furniture to shift about as you like." His face darkened as the fiery tone of her voice cut into him. He rose, shoving the chair back noisily on the stone floor, and towered over her as his hand slammed against the table. "Do not lecture me," he roared. "You forget yourself, woman. You've no place to question or judge. If you cannot keep your silence, you'll regret the day you married into this family." Her fear clashed with her rising fury, but something inside her broke away in that moment, something that had held her silent for too long. "If silence is what you wanted," she said, stepping closer, "then you should have left me where I was. I would have taken quiet fields over this prison. You wanted power, not a wife. And now, even that contemptible power isn't enough for you." Her words hit their mark. He turned from her abruptly, pacing the room with quick, heavy steps, as if trying to collect a reasonable reply before his temper unraveled further. He did not look at her as he spoke again, his tone now heavy with warning. "Leave this room," he said, "before I lose the patience I've spared for you." But she did not leave. Instead, she moved toward him, stepping into the space he had tried to carve for himself. "Do with me what you will," she said, her hands, tense and trembling, open to her sides. "I know now what you are. Do you even know what you've become?" The words were too much. He turned swiftly, his face red with rage, and before the thought could cross her mind to step back, his hand struck out, finding her shoulder with force. She stumbled, her balance slipping beneath her surprise, but she did not fall. She lifted her face, defiant, and he struck her again. The second blow carried more than anger. It silenced her with a pain that radiated deep, sending her crumpling as her knees found the stone-cold floor. She gasped, twisting, but no pleas came from her lips. She would not give him that. He stood over her now, breathing heavily, the madness of his rage clouding his mind. It only took a moment more. A hand gripping her by the shoulder, shaking her frail body as though it might dispel her accusations. There were no witnesses. No servants in the chamber now cast their eyes downward, pretending not to see. All that transpired between them lingered in the quiet of that room. His fingers curled around her throat in a brutal grip, silencing what breath remained. Her eyes stared up at him wide, determined, even in those final, shaking moments of her life. When at last her body fell lifeless, the silence returned, but it was no peace to him. The Lord stepped back, his mind reeling over what his rage had compelled him to take. The broken curve of her form on the stone floor was not a picture he could turn from, nor one he could undo. He fled the chamber and left the castle dim with the brightness it had lost. Somewhere, within its walls, hidden from prying eyes, her body was laid to its final rest. Or so he thought. The castle did not forget her. Her body lay hidden where his trembling, guilty hands had left it. The Lord had thought the stone would keep her silent forever, that death itself might erase her. But it was the manner of her passing, the rage and betrayal that had marked it, that wove her spirit into the stones. Leap Castle became a tomb for her flesh, but it was no resting place for her soul. She had died without peace, and that kind of death does not end quietly. It began softly at first, as such things often do. It was no great clap of thunder or sudden blaze from the hearth. The first sign of her was the feeling that she was not altogether gone. Those who passed the hallways of the upper floors after her death claimed they felt something brush their skin, a pull in the stale air as though the castle stirred when no one was near. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways, steady and light like they'd been when she had walked them alive. A servant who had brought her tray each morning swore he saw her figure once at the top of the stone stairwell, her face pale, her eyes fixed on him, with a sadness that rooted him to the ground. Then he blinked, and she was gone. But these glimpses were only the beginning. The women who had tended her chambers after her death refused to enter them any more. It was late one autumn night when she fully returned, not a fleeting shadow at the edge of a servant's sight, but whole and standing. The Lord himself was the first to see her. He wandered alone like a lion restless in its cage. His conscience had not been at rest since her body had left his sight. He drank to drown it, walked to escape it, raged silently into the void of his dim-lit chambers. But guilt does not loosen its grip so easily. When his boots struck the stone landing toward the solitary wing of the castle, he saw her, standing at the end of the hall. She didn't move, but her shape was unmistakable, standing where he had stood on that night. Her dress was red where it had been once green, long and flowing, as though soaked with the blood she'd left behind. Her face bore the unmarred features he had once praised in the early days of their marriage, but her eyes settled on him, sending a chill through him. He shouted, calling her name, as if the sound of it coming from his lips might make her vanish. But she did not move, and her shape did not waver. She stood like a statue carved of vengeance itself, staring at him with the kind of resolve that belongs only to those who've known their final injustice. His voice cracked with questions and curses, but she answered none. Slowly, she raised her left hand, gesturing toward the place where he now flinched. He recognized the meaning of that silent accusation, and his face grew pale, his pulse fast and hollow. From that night on, no man could walk the halls of Leap Castle with certainty. She was no longer a fleeting spectre, but a flame that burned steady, bright in her grief and fury. Her presence would press itself into the stone long after the last light had faded from her husband's miserable life. Wherever she walked, the cold bit deeper, and the sound of her movements left no question of her purpose. She had become the thing they called her now, the Red Lady, a figure who would not be silenced or remain still. And so her watch began, not for peace or rest, but for retribution that never arrived. The castle kept her as she had been, bound in sorrow and tethered by betrayal. Her figure became as much a part of Leap Castle as the stones that held it high, and those who gazed too long into the unlit corners often claimed they could feel her watching, always there and never at peace. The chilling tales of Leap Castle's hauntings owe much to the Red Lady, whose spectral presence has shaped the castle's infamy. Among the most memorable encounters are stories that continue to evoke both awe and terror, standing as reminders to the sorrow and fury that bind her to this place. As we near the end of this episode, as we bring this episode to a close where we learned about the origins, or at least the origins as we've imagined them, of the legend of the Red Lady of Leap Castle, let's briefly go over some of the true tales of hauntings people have experienced at her hands. In the early 20th century, when the Darbys still called Leap Castle their home, a guest, unaware of the castle's dark reputation, was assigned to a room called the Blue Room for the night. Known among the servants as one of the most haunted chambers, the room had become infamous for sights and sounds that could not be explained. The guest retired early, but as night enveloped the castle, an oppressive sensation began to take hold. The air, though calm, seemed to press inward, a suffocating presence that had him tossing and turning. His rest was shattered fully when he awoke to the feeling of being watched. Blinking into the pitch darkness, he became aware of a figure standing near the window. The figure was that of a tall woman cloaked in a flowing red gown, her face illuminated by an eerie internal glow. Though she said nothing, her eyes carried a mixture of sorrow and rage so piercing that the guest could not bring himself to move or breathe. A dagger gleamed in her raised hand, a manifestation of the grudge she carried through eternity. The figure loomed closer until he struck a match, fumbling to light the candle by his bedside. The instant the room was filled with light, she was gone. Reports of the Blue Room's ghostly sobbing had been circulated before, but the guest's first-hand account of her spectral fury reached many ears, solidifying her place in the lore of Leap Castle. Also during the Darby family's residence, an exorcist was once summoned to free the castle of its lingering spirits. A priest, deeply rooted in his faith, but unprepared for the ferocity of what awaited him, arrived ready to confront the supernatural. The Bloody Chapel, a site already steeped in bloodshed from centuries past, was where he chose to begin his rites. The chapel was silent as he began his prayers, words echoing faintly against the stone walls. But soon, an icy chill descended, so sharp that it numbed his hands and made his breath hang visibly in the air. Before him, a form began to take shape. The Red Lady stood at the altar, her figure glowing faintly, her dagger glinting in the dim light. Her gaze, filled with an accusatory sorrow, locked onto the priest, silencing his prayers. Though he faltered, he pressed on, his trembling hands clutching his Bible. She did not lunge at him, nor did she retreat. She only stood, a frozen apparition of fury and grief, a force that words of prayer could not quell. The priest left Leap Castle that day a changed man. He spoke of the spirit not as one to be banished, but as one firmly tethered to the place, a presence neither heaven nor earth could yet claim. His failure became another chapter in the legend of the Red Lady, proof of the curse's unyielding grip on the old walls. Though these encounters are among the most well-known, they are far from unique. The Red Lady continues to make her presence known, standing guard over the history that cannot be rewritten, her wrath and sorrow ensuring her story endures across time. Those who venture into Leap Castle must tread carefully, for in its halls, the past is never far away, and the Red Lady walks still. Well, listeners, I hope you have enjoyed these two tales from the Leap Castle extended universe, so to speak. Next week, we will be back for more to truly establish why this is one of the most haunted places anywhere. Now, if you should find yourself in Leap Castle thanks to the hospitality of its current stewards, the Ryan family, be sure to ask them about the stories of the Red Lady and the Bloody Chapel, and then maybe tell us if we got anything wrong in our imagining. As always, stay curious, stay cautious, and we'll see you next time on Macabrium's Lore and Legends.